Great, thank you very much. So I'm Ben Olken from MIT. I'm also one of the global directors of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which is a network of researchers based at MIT, but around the world. I'm speaking today on our work on performance pay for tax collectors, which was done right here in Punjab, working with the Excise and Taxation Department. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the many people who have been sort of instrumental to this project. There are too many to name individually because this is really a collaborative effort with a very large number of people. But obviously I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Asim Khwaja from the Harvard Kennedy School and from SERP, Nan Khan, who you were introduced to before from the GC, our research team who's here, and of course the many people in the Excise and Taxation Department of the government of Punjab who have been very supportive of this project. So thank you, all of you. And to the IGC, this is really a collaborative effort that couldn't have been done without everyone's support. So, quick outline, I'll tell you a little bit about the motivation, design, results, and policy implications, and I'll also talk about next steps, which is a lot for 25 minutes, but I don't have that many slides, it'll be just fine. So, by way of motivation, we're interested in property tax and improving property tax through performance incentives because it seems like there's a real problem here, right? So if you look at sort of the property tax collection in Punjab, it's about 10 to 20% the levels of comparable countries. Now, part of that is an issue, is the rates are low, but part of it is also that the collections are not as high as one might expect them to be. And in fact, this is a map showing different circles in Faisalabad, and what you can see is that not only is there, not only is the level not necessarily high, but there's a lot of heterogeneity. Like some of these tax circles or tax areas are recovering a lot of revenue, others are not. And that suggests, or that maybe sort of thinking about the role of the individual tax inspectors could be important for improving tax performance. And so this project was designed in close collaboration with the E&T department to help understand whether performance incentives for tax collectors could improve the performance of the tax system. And I guess there were two questions. The first question is, would performance incentives work? Will they actually result in increased revenue? And the second is, what are the implications for sort of taxpayer attitudes towards the government and towards the tax office, right? So what's the trade-off that the government has to think through between getting more revenue by incentivizing tax and maybe having people who are in some sense, less happy with the tax department because they're concerned about over-aggressive behavior by tax officers? And so the question was to try to address these. The project was trying to figure out the answer to this. Now, how did we do that? I should say this project was a randomized controlled trial. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we developed these 3 different incentive schemes, which I'll describe in a second, in collaboration with the E&T department. And then whether the tax inspectors received performance pay or not, and if they received performance pay, which version of the performance pay they assigned, this was assigned by ballot, by lottery, right? And so because of that, because of the random assignment, we can compare the tax inspectors who were randomly chosen by ballot to receive the incentives to those that were not, to figure out the impact of the program. And I should say another reason that I think the public ballot was very helpful in our case was in this case, these incentives are something that most people want, right? There was an opportunity to really improve your pay. And I think if this had been tried in a way that wasn't by sort of public ballot, there might have been perceptions of, how come he got it and I didn't get it? But the fact that this was a public and transparent process, I think, meant that we were able to not only evaluate in a credible way what happened, but also, I think, improve sort of the ability to even try this as a pilot because it improved sort of the perceptions of fairness. So what did we do? So we had 3 different incentive schemes. The first incentive scheme was just a simple payment to tax inspectors based on how much revenue they collected above some pre-specified historical benchmark. Okay, so based on historical data, we could project how much they should receive, and then anything they collect, how much they would collect with sort of business as usual. Anything they collected above that, the 3 people who work in the tax circle, the inspector, the constable, and the clerk, basically shared on average about 30% of the proceeds above the historical benchmark. And this was enough to create a pretty substantial increase in their salaries. The second incentive scheme was what we called Revenue Plus, and here the idea was to say, look, it maybe and this was a concern that we heard from the E&T department, maybe if we incentivize people so strongly just on revenue, they may neglect the other aspects of their job. Or they may, in particular, they may sort of, really crack down on certain types of taxpayers, so accuracy might suffer, or they may just be really aggressive and therefore taxpayer satisfaction may suffer. And so the idea of the Revenue Plus scheme was to explicitly try to deal with these other dimensions that the government cared about and provide incentives both based on revenue and also based on accuracy and taxpayer satisfaction measured through an independent survey. The final incentive scheme was what we called the flexible bonus scheme. And in this scheme, the tax department had what was called a performance evaluation committee who could evaluate the tax inspectors on all of the aspects of their job performance. So the revenue, the additional accuracy and customer satisfaction, plus other characteristics they thought were important. And the idea here was that there's a lot of soft information, potentially, about which tax areas are difficult, which are easy, that we wanted them to be able to incorporate into their performance rewards. Okay, and so we tried all three of those different schemes. And as I mentioned, so this was 482 tax circles were allocated into one of these four schemes. About 45%, or about 210 or so out of the 482 received the treatments, and the rest were in the control group. So what did we find? So overall, this by the way shows you the public ballot that we ran. So overall, the incentives increased revenue by about 8%, or 8 percentage points. That means that if revenue would have grown, say, 10%, is that we had no change in taxpayer satisfaction overall. So if you were worried that by giving these performance-based incentives, people would kind of crack down and taxpayers would get upset, overall we didn't find evidence of that. Okay, so overall it seems like it improves revenue. So this shows you so this is showing you the treatment effects for the overall, pooling all the incentives together compared to the control group. And what you can see is that this is our first year, this is our second year, that in the first year, and the stars indicate statistical significance. What you can see is in the first year there was about an 8% increase overall. There was a large initial increase in sort of collection of back arrears, right? And in the second year, the arrears increase fell, but the overall effect stayed the same, right? So they're having about an 8 percentage points higher growth rate in taxes than they would have had otherwise. Now, when we turn to the three versions of the different incentive schemes, we found that there was a pretty important trade-off that in some sense the government faces by providing explicit multi-dimensional incentives. So what does that mean? So in particular, we found the revenue scheme appears the most effective. So about a 15 percentage point increase in the rate of increase of current year's revenues. So about double the average effect. So if you only incentivize revenue, you've got about double the average effect for on revenue. Now, you can do the math. What that implies is that the rest of the incentive schemes were less effective than the pure revenue scheme, right? So in some sense, if you incentivize revenue only, you got a much bigger effect on revenue. When you started to incentivize other types of incentive schemes, there was a trade-off and you had much lower impacts on revenue. Now, interestingly, the revenue scheme was no worse than the control areas on some of the non-revenue outcomes like taxpayer satisfaction or accuracy of tax assessment or perceptions of corruption in the tax department. So in general, it looks like the revenue scheme in some sense provided a lot more revenue for the government and didn't suffer on these other dimensions. Now, what about the scheme where we explicitly tried to incentivize these other dimensions, right? The non-revenue outcomes like taxpayer satisfaction and accuracy of tax assessment. So there, the impact on revenue was about half as big, but only about 7.5% on current year's revenue. So what you can see is that there was a pretty substantial trade-off in lost revenue when you had these multidimensional incentives. There was, I would say, a slight improvement in these other dimensions, like particularly taxpayer satisfaction was in fact, and as measured by an independent survey, was in fact slightly higher in the revenue group, in the revenue plus group relative to the other groups, the revenue plus and the control group. So it does seem like you got a little something, but as I'll talk about in a few slides, this decline in revenue was substantial enough that essentially the revenue scheme was highly cost effective for the government, right? The returns to the government were substantially above the increased payments to the tax inspectors, but the Revenue Plus scheme was basically not. The final scheme, the flexible bonus scheme, in fact, had basically no detectable impact on tax revenues. And I think the one possible conclusion of this is to say, look, in the revenue scheme, it was very clear what the inspector needed to do. Revenue Plus scheme was a little more complicated. The flexible bonus scheme was very hard for the inspector potentially to figure out what they should be doing, right? To sort of impress this performance evaluation committee. Even though the performance evaluation committee ultimately issued clear, a bunch of criteria of how they were going to assess people, we find no impact. And I think a reasonable conclusion from that is that if you're going to have these incentives, they need to be formulaic and quite clear, so that people know what they need to do to optimize against them. So this sort of shows you the increase in the first year, and you can see again the schemes are diverging over time. So blue is revenue, red is Revenue Plus, green is flexible bonus, and you can sort of see that this is on total revenue, current plus arrears. The results are even starker if you look at just current year's tax collections. And what you can see is that these schemes are kind of diverging over time, right? With the revenue scheme having the biggest impact on revenue, and as you move away from that, smaller and smaller impacts on tax revenue. So, what's driving these results? What changes? I think if you look at what's behind the results, what's actually, how do these tax inspectors get these additional impacts? So we can decompose the results into changes in the tax base, going out and finding new properties or finding unassessed properties and adding them to the tax base. Into, number one, reductions in exemptions. So there's all kinds of rules in the Punjab property tax about what are exemptions of various types. Maybe they give out fewer of these exemptions. And the third thing is maybe they are recovering more. Maybe the recovery rate increases. So overall, we find, and I think ex ante before we started, we didn't know kind of what are the margins that these inspectors can use to increase revenues. And what we found almost all of the action was coming through increasing the tax base. So with these incentives, they went out and found new properties and added them to the tax rolls. One thing that I think this suggests is that it may be that these gains may end up being long-lived. So even after the incentives, if the incentives are change over time, you may decrease over time, you may still continue to get these gains, because once these properties are added to the tax rolls, they may get taxed sort of year after year after year. So instead, what we found that sort of expansion of the tax base is crucial. In addition, what we found, if you look at who they're adding to the tax base, they're doing it with a very small number of properties. So those changes you saw are driven by a very small number of additional properties, typically high-value commercial properties. And so I think what they're doing is sort of saying, look, I want to, in some sense, the tax department, the tax inspectors are internalizing, in some sense, the potentially the political cost of this, and figuring out who are the people that can most effectively, how can I get the most revenue with the sort of the smallest number of taxpayers? Who are the really high value people I need to go add? And that's who they're going after. And so that's, I think, what's driving the results. Now, one thing worth noting is that we do find some evidence in our survey that unofficial payments reported by the sort of reported in the property survey do seem to increase for some taxpayers, although not for the ones who are reassessed. So there is some potential evidence that these unofficial payments to tax inspectors are increasing. I think that's something that one needs to be cautious about, but nevertheless, people's overall perceptions of satisfaction towards the tax department do not seem to be changing. So, what does this imply for the policy for the government? So, I think this suggests, and I think this is one of probably the first kind of rigorous, certainly the first randomized trial, and one of the first rigorous assessments of performance pay and tax really anywhere in the world. What I think this suggests is that these incentives based on revenue can in fact be a cost-effective way to increase revenue, right? And so the increase, particularly for the revenue scheme, and particularly for large tax areas like those in Lahore, the increase in revenue the government received far exceeded the cost of the payments, and so this can be a very profitable or net gain for the government with very few sort of political costs. Now, in terms of the trade-off between more revenue and these other dimensions of sort of taxpayer satisfaction, there is potentially a trade-off there. The Revenue Plus scheme, did do better on these non-revenue outcomes, but at a very substantial cost to the government in terms of foregone revenue. And so I think what that suggests is that it's so much so that the government basically breaks even, or certainly not getting a huge net return on the Revenue Plus scheme. And so in some sense that sort of, I think, leaves the government with a very clear choice. If you're going to do these schemes, I think that sort of a straightforward incentives on revenue that are easy for the tax inspectors to understand and follow seem to be the most effective. And I think that's the question for the government to think through. Oops. So that's what we've been doing thus far with working with the Excise and Taxation Department. I want to spend just a couple of minutes telling you a bit about what we're doing now. So I think based on this very successful engagement with the Excise and Taxation Department, one of the things that they said that they really wanted us to help them think about is how you assign or post tax inspectors to specific locations. Okay? And they said, well, look, and this has two different issues, right? The first issue is, there are many factors that kind of influence why a tax inspector might get put in a particular place. So as a result, we may not be putting the best people in the places where they can make the biggest difference. We may have sort of a mismatch of where the tax inspector should be. And the second thing is that's kind of an allocation effect, right? You want to sort of allocate people to the right places. And the second thing that's important is that actually, in some sense, even more than the financial rewards, the tax inspectors may care a lot about where they're placed. And that could be just because some circles are more attractive. Maybe it's for idiosyncratic personal reasons, like they want to be working close to their home. A variety of reasons. People seem to care a lot about where they're located. And so the second aspect of these postings could be to say, look, can you use where people are posted as an incentive device? Right, as a way of incentivizing people to work harder to sort of get a posting that they're really happy with. And so, working again with the property tax department at E&T, we've designed a merit-based transfer program which works like this. So inspectors are grouped into groups of 10 within their division, and they're told that at the end of the year, they're going to be assessed based on their performance in terms of increased revenue with the same type of things we were doing in the revenue treatment before. And they're going to be ranked on their performance above their benchmarks. And then we're going to say, look, among the 10 positions that were in this group, you're going to get to pick, where do you want to be? First, the top performer gets first pick, the second performer gets second pick, and so on. And that's going to have two important impacts. The first is the top performers are going to get to pick the most attractive circles, so that could help reallocate people to better locations. And the second effect is that it can motivate people and sort of say, look, if I want to get a better circle, or even if I want to make sure I have a high enough rank to stay in the circle I'm in, I need to work hard. And so this has been, once again, this was assigned by public ballot, and we assigned this was done last July. So inspectors this fiscal year know that they're subject to these incentives. And then the transfers will be implemented according to this protocol at the beginning of next fiscal year in July of this year. And then again, we'll do the same thing. We'll select a new group of people who will have the same incentives moving forward during the 2014-2015 tax year. And so I think this is another important aspect to consider in terms of the overall design of the civil service system of how do you sort of make sure you put the right people in the right places, and can you use that as an incentive device? And that's, I think, something that's, as I said, ongoing now, and hopefully in a year we'll be able to, or a year or two, we'll be able to report to you what those results are as well. And the final concluding thought I just wanted to leave you with is that, in some sense, what we've done now are two important aspects of sort of HR policy and tax. The first one is sort of performance pay and what's the implications of that. The second one is this question of assignment and how do you get the right people in the right jobs. I think the third area, and this is not one that we've explored yet, but I think are very eager to work with the government on, either here in Punjab or potentially working with FBR or wherever the right place to do it is to say, how do you improve your ability to select the best people and attract the best people into the civil service more generally, or into the tax service in particular? And that has two potential implications. There's two potential ways you could think about that. The first is to say, look, we as was discussed at the earlier session, there have been increases in sort of the pay levels at FBR, for example. Did that result in more qualified people being attracted to these jobs? Right? If you just increase the pay level, maybe that doesn't have a huge impact for the people who are already there. Maybe it does, but certainly it might change who decides they want this job. And the second thing is, you might say, well, what's the implication for performance pay? It may be that the kinds of people who decide they want to be a tax inspector in the world where kind of wages are not particularly high and there's no reward for performance are very different than the sorts of people who would decide to be a tax inspector if they knew there was they could get performance pay. And maybe you would get a different kind of people into the job if you incorporated, if they knew that they were going to get these different types of compensation policies at the time they decided whether to join the civil service or join the tax office compared to other jobs. And so I just want to leave you with this thought. I think this is a really, in some sense, that would, if you think of the two things we've done in performance pay. We've studied in performance pay. We've studied transfers, or studying now transfers and postings, merit-based transfers. I think this is kind of the third area of HR policy that I think is very important to explore. Thank you very much.